My name is Reverend Joe Wiersema. I use they, them pronouns. I serve as the pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Oregon, Wisconsin, and I also work as a summer camp director in Stronghold, Illinois for 1 week a year, working with LGBTQ teens who are aged 12 to 17. And I am very nervous and excited to be here. The last time I was on this chancel, I was standing about right here, and I was getting married. That was 7 years ago, so it's a little surreal to have that full circle moment, looking very different than I did then. So if this were a different service, if I were preaching on any other Sunday, or if this was a sermon that I was preaching in my home congregation in Oregon, I would start this sermon with an incredible anecdote. You'd relate to it, you'd laugh at all the right times, and then we would get into the really cool stuff that I want to say about Transfiguration Sunday. And yet, it's pertinent to address that this isn't any ordinary sermon. And although I personally believe all sermons are special, this sermon is different because the space we have today, the space we build in a place like Pres House, requires a precedent of vulnerability and compassion. So my goal today is not to preach a sermon where you feel like you heard from a trans pastor, though by nature of me being me, that'll be what happens. My goal today is that trans or queer, girly pop or gay, hetero or asking a lot of questions, I want you to hear this sermon as the person this sermon was meant for. A sermon about transformation for all y'all. Because Transfiguration Sunday isn't just for some of us to resonate and for others to sit back and observe. Transfiguration Sunday is a reclamation and proclamation that Jesus is an absolute transformed diva and a reminder that every single one of us is worthy of feeling at home in our own bodies. Because feeling at home in our bodies is similar to the experience we feel when we go somewhere familiar, like when we talked about in 2+ earlier. It's your childhood home or the woods. It's an experience where expectation and judgment are left at the threshold. It's the same thing in our bodies. I grew up in the queer community. My mom is a very classic 90s lesbian, and I was the toddler in overalls and rainbow shirts at Austin Pride each year as a kid. I grew up having a very homonormative view of the world, assuming people were queer until they confirmed otherwise. But gender wasn't something I spent a lot of time thinking about. Eventually, gender just felt like a job that I went to each day. With makeup and dresses, ladies' nights, and book clubs, I was clocking in each morning to play the part of wife or woman. But really, at the end of the day, my body felt like it wasn't mine. And then, impulsively, I bought a chest binder a few years ago. And for the first time in my life, with my chest bound and a very cheesy Hawaiian shirt on, I felt like my body was mine again. With tiny steps, with pronoun changes, and a largely thrifted wardrobe, I no longer felt like I was clocking into my life. I wasn't performing an act that everyone wanted of me, but I was sitting in a body that felt like home. Transitioning isn't something that happens on a single day. Transformation happens over time, but there are moments when everything changes inside, even if no one else notices. It's the first time I introduced myself using they, them pronouns, and the day I woke up after top surgery, sore and smiling because my body was mine. And transitioning is less of an outfit change and more of a metamorphosis, or becoming into yourself. Transitioning personally, physically, hormonally, or socially. When we transition, we recognize ourselves as people who will never be the same again. People who are intended to change into different ways throughout our lives. So we see a transformation and a metamorphosis in the Transfiguration today. Jesus is transformed before Peter, James, and John, and this transformation comes on the mountaintop and is accompanied by dazzling clothes and something that deeply changes Christ's. It's then that we're told that Elijah and Moses have shown up to the shindig, and Peter stumbles through his plan before God appears as a cloud and speaks to Christ. I adore this scene in Mark because it's my favorite form of storytelling, where the story becomes increasingly more dramatic with each and every sentence that is said. So let's start at the beginning. Jesus was transfigured before them. The word transfigured in Greek is metamorpho, and so this word is actually only used 4 times in the New Testament, and it's not just a transfiguration or a transformation of clothing. It's really the act of being metamorphized. Jesus changes in form, not just to put on shinier clothes, but to become something entirely different. The change is both inside and out. The clothes reflect what is happening to Christ internally. Jesus, metamorphized in the fully divine self, is recognized by a self that is also fully human, and Jesus was metamorphized and everything was different. The transfiguration is both an extraordinary and ordinary experience. It's the physical and emotional change that Jesus undergoes as God, and yet, as a human, Christ is experiencing what we all have within us. And understanding what the metamorphosis of self looks like when we align with who you know you are inside with who you are outside. So the transfiguration happens, and then Moses and Elijah show up to the party. And Moses and Elijah return to usher in the coming of God's kingdom. Moses and Elijah, who are long since deceased on paper, but might not be as dead as everyone thought. You see, their deaths were not documented in the nice, tidy way many deaths are documented in the Old Testament. Moses, the first lawgiver, is buried in Moab, but his actual final resting place is never documented. In a similar way, Elijah, the first of the great prophets, doesn't die per se, but there's this awesome scene in 2 Kings where a bunch of chariots of fire and horses of fire show up, and Elijah just goes up in a whirlwind to heaven. 2 men who are no longer walking on earth, and yet their bodies were never committed to the land. 2 main characters of the Old Testament have come down at this metamorphizing event of Jesus to see what he is like in this transformation. They begin to chat with Jesus, and we, as the reader, don't know the words of that conversation. But 3 of the most important people in the Bible are hanging out, which means something has changed. Something is not the same. Elijah and Moses appear, and their presence alone confirms to Jesus and his disciples that he is indeed the Messiah, the prophet who was to come, the one who brings forth the kingdom of God. Jesus has transformed. He's seeing the greatest people from history present before him, and then Peter talks. We don't know what Jesus, Moses, and Elijah spoke about, but we do know what Peter says, because Peter, in the face of all change and glory, wants this moment to last forever. He goes on about how it'll be so much fun, it's so private, to be together on a hill. And he's asking how we can put down some roots and remain in this bubble. And still, before Peter can get too far down the rabbit trail, God shows up, thank goodness. Classic God showing up in a cloud. But what God says feels familiar. This is my son, the beloved, listen to him. It's an echo of Jesus' baptism in Mark 1. You are my son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased. Christ fully transformed, metamorphized, and God still calls him beloved. These holy moments in the life of Christ are what connect us to God in our own moments of transformation. These holy moments remind us that we too can be transformed. This holy experience, seen from the outside, grounds us in the reality that Christ, fully human and fully divine, was drastically transformed, and that God still fiercely loves him. So oftentimes we're told by society and the church about how we're supposed to grow in our faith, what it looks like to change and become closer to God, but Jesus reminds us through the transfiguration that the rules don't always look like how we expect them to. The rules are based on our own experiences and compassionate connection with others, not external social standards. So much of my own theology on this transfiguration is verbalized well in a collection of essays called Transbiblical. I was supposed to bring it, but I forgot it. So imagine I'm holding up a book. It says Transbiblical. It's rainbow colored, obviously. It tends to lean a bit more on the academic side of theological books, but Katie Valentine says this about the transfiguration. For many trans people, gender confirmation is a resurrection that is not metaphorical, but concretely tangible. Trans bodies often metamorphose and change gloriously, not in one divine moment, but over weeks, months, or years, to have the exterior body match the inward identity. And Jesus' own dazzling queer trans body in the transfiguration connects the past, present, and future, showcasing the body and its many forms and stages of transition. Dear friends, each of us will experience a transition in self at some point in our lives. For my trans and gender expansive siblings in the room, maybe it's a physical one or a social one. Changing your body, clothing, name, or pronouns. For others of you, it's the transition of self to match your values, your confidence, your desire to relate to others that you have on the inside. This transformation, this metamorphosis, is what Christ calls us to in this life. We're called to go up to the mountaintop with our pals and come back down a changed person. We're meant to see God in the cloud and come to terms with the holy transformation that will happen in us. Maybe on a single day, maybe across many years. This transformation isn't one that God gives to us in a nice, tidy, orderly way, telling us exactly how to change. No. God has given us the gift of co-creation so that we might build and rebuild our own transformations alongside God. So what I normally do at FPC is I give people 3 main points to remember. So if you don't remember anything else I say, these are the 3 things to remember. Right? The first one is that we are people intended to change. This isn't a statement only for the queer folks in the room. This can feel counterintuitive to the idea that we're always the same person. But we are all people meant to change, grow, and become who we are meant to be. We are at the ready to be formed and patiently await as we arise. The second thing I want you to take away from the sermon today is when we transform ourselves, those around us may not completely understand what's happening. Peter, James, and John walked away from the transfiguration none the wiser. And as much as we wish to be seen by those around us, we may be dazzling and transformed, and still those who walk alongside us may not see our full selves or who we are inside, but that does not change the fact that we are transformed. And the third thing I want you to take away from this sermon today is that God sees you. God sees you in your transformation. God sees you at the beginning of the questions and the doubts and calls you beloved. God sees you in your transformed self, and still you are named and beloved. God's compassion does not stop at who you were at one time. God's compassion does not stop as we co-create this world alongside them. You are so beloved. And the joy of this concept of transformation is not limited to humanity. Butterflies are often the default metaphor for metamorphosis, but my favorite example of radical transformation is where we as people act as co-creators for something completely new. And the best example I have of co-creation in something completely new is bread. I have been baking fairly regularly for the last decade or so. I love bread. I'm not too picky about bread, about the type I make and eat, but the first bread I ever learned how to make was challah. And challah, if you don't know, is a braided Jewish loaf made with eggs and honey. It comes out crisp and golden brown with an inside so light and fluffy, it tastes like you're eating air. So the first time I made bread, I pulled out my Julia Child cookbook. I carefully followed the instructions to warm the milk and let the yeast froth a little bit with some sugar. I waited for the creaking of my stand mixer to stop as it struggled through the flour, eggs, and honey. And then I waited some more. I set a timer for the first rise, puttering around my house to avoid leaving the bread unsupervised, lest it not rise without me there to watch it. After a second rise, I was able to follow the little pictures in my cookbook for braiding the loaves as they might look like something in a bakery window. I covered them for a third rise, still puttering and doubting. But when another alarm went off to check on them, it was like something I'd never seen before. Large to the point of almost falling off the pan, my little flour, yeast, and patience became a beautiful loaf. I covered an egg wash and placed it in the oven, sitting on the ground of my kitchen with the oven light on, watching as they baked and continued to grow, transforming before my very eyes alongside the simple gifts of the earth. Honey and eggs, yeast and flour, I helped to create something entirely new to me, something that had not previously been in my little apartment kitchen. Co-creating with the gifts of God, something new arose. Maybe your holy experiences don't include sitting on the floor watching bread, but mine do. God gave us wheat, not because we're meant to only eat wheat from the stalk and nothing else. God gave us wheat and patience and creativity to create incredible things that the gifts of God have given us. God gave us wheat so that we can make croissants and spaghetti and donuts. God gave us wheat so that we may find our own hope in creating our own change. We too are wheat in that regard. We are gifts of God to be molded, changed, and formed into something new. Maybe we are formed into something you've never seen before, yet beautiful and co-created with God. Dear friends, I hope you see yourself and one another with the astounding awe that God sees in us. I hope you take time to metamorphose into all that you are called into being. I hope you taste and see that God is good, as they made each thing in this world to be transformed, co-created, and reinvented alongside humanity. I hope you metamorphose in dazzling color and rise as yeast greater than anyone could have imagined. I hope you transfigure in the company of your ancestors who see you as you truly are. And through all these things, I hope you know that God sees you and knows you and will forever call you beloved. Thanks be to God.